4,800,000,000 cubic meters of water per hour. That was the flow rate required to cover every valley, every plain, and every mountain range of the ancient world in 40 days. No civilization has recorded anything like it before or since. And at the center of it all, a single 600-year-old man building a ship in the middle of dry land. This is the account of how God decided to drown all of humanity, and why. Put into perspective what the biblical text describes in the opening verses of Genesis 6. Humanity had multiplied across the face of the earth. 10 generations had passed since Adam, and the text does not use vague language to describe what had happened to the human species in that interval. Genesis 6, verse 5, records that every imagination of the thoughts of man's heart was continually evil, not partially, not occasionally, continually. The Hebrew term used is yetzer, which describes the deepest inclination of the self, the internal mechanism that shapes every decision, every desire, every plan. And that mechanism, according to the record, was corrupted at its root. Consider the concrete implication of that. An entire civilization, estimates based on population growth rates suggest somewhere between 5 billion and 10 billion people living in that period, accounting for more than 1,600 years between creation and the flood, had reached a point where moral corruption was not the exception. It was the norm. Genesis 6, verse 11, reinforces it. The earth was corrupt before God and filled with violence. The Hebrew word for violence here is Hamas, carrying the weight of deliberate cruelty, systematic oppression, institutionalized injustice. This was not merely crime, it was a system. And that system had roots that go deeper than most people imagine when they think about the flood. Genesis 6, verses 1 through 4, opens one of the most debated passages in the entire Hebrew Bible. The sons of God saw that the daughters of men were beautiful and took for themselves wives of all they chose. The identity of these sons of God, in Hebrew, Bnei Ha-Elohim, has generated centuries of scholarly debate. The book of Job, chapter 1, verse 6, and chapter 2, verse 1, uses the same expression to describe angelic beings presenting themselves before God. The book of Jude, verse 6, in the New Testament, speaks of angels who did not keep their principality and abandoned their own dwelling. 2 Peter, chapter 2, verse 4, mentions angels who sinned and were cast into Tartarus. The apocryphal text of 1 Enoch, chapters 6 through 10, expands this narrative with details that circulated widely throughout Second Temple Judaism. Observe the scene the biblical text draws, a transgression of cosmic boundaries, beings from one sphere invading another, and the result of that union was the Nephilim, described in Genesis 6, verse 4, as the mighty men and men of renown of antiquity. The Septuagint, the Greek translation of the Old Testament produced by 72 scholars in the 3rd century before the Common Era, renders Nephilim as giants. The Book of Numbers, chapter 13, verse 33, confirms that these beings were of extraordinary stature. The Israelite spies felt like grasshoppers in their presence. But the problem was not merely the size of these beings. It was what they represented. The corruption described in Genesis 6 was not only moral, it was genetic, it was ontological. Human nature itself, created in the image of God according to Genesis 1, verse 27, was being adulterated. The original design of creation, human beings made with dignity, purpose, and the capacity for relationship with the Creator, was being systematically dismantled, and that casts an entirely different light on the divine decision to send the flood. This was not the impulsive reaction of an angry God. It was a surgical intervention to preserve what remained intact within the human lineage. Examine the details of Genesis 6, verse 8. Noah found grace in the eyes of the Lord, and verse 9 adds something most readers move past too quickly. Noah was a just man, and perfect in his generations. The phrase perfect in his generations, in Hebrew tamim bedorotav, is the same word used to describe unblemished animals set apart for sacrifice. Some scholars argue the term refers not only to Noah's moral integrity, but to the integrity of his lineage. His genealogy had not been contaminated. He was literally, genetically intact. That changes everything. Grasp what was at stake. If the pure human lineage were completely corrupted, there would be no channel for the Messiah promised in Genesis 3 and verse 15. The seed of the woman who would crush the head of the serpent. The flood from this vantage point was not gratuitous destruction. It was radical preservation. The species needed to be saved from itself and from forces that extended far beyond itself. But what God felt before acting has yet to be revealed. Genesis 6 verse 6 contains one of the most disturbing declarations in all of Scripture. And the Lord repented that he had made man on the earth, and it grieved him in his heart. The Hebrew verb is nacham, conveying deep pain, visceral lamentation, a sorrow that manifests in the very being of God. And itztsev, translated as it grieved him, shares the same root used in Genesis 3 verse 16 to describe the pain of childbirth. The rabbinic tradition interpreted this as God experiencing a grief comparable to that of a mother in the suffering that precedes new life. Silence. Before the sentence of judgment, there was mourning. Before the water, there was a tear. The text does not present a cold God executing an administrative decision. It presents a creator wounded by the degradation of his creation. And even so, the decision came. Genesis 6 verse 13, the end of all flesh has come before me, for the earth is filled with violence. Behold, I will destroy them with the earth. Follow the sequence of what came next. God gives Noah detailed instructions for the construction of an ark. Genesis 6 verses 14 through 16 provides technical specifications that modern naval engineers have analyzed with astonishment. 300 cubits in length, approximately 137 meters, 50 cubits in width, around 23 meters, 30 cubits in height, roughly 14 meters. The resulting ratio, 6:1, is nearly identical to that used in modern ocean cargo vessels, optimized for maximum stability in open water. No other wooden vessel of antiquity came remotely close to those dimensions. The largest wooden ship ever built in the modern era, the Wyoming, launched in 1909, measured 91 meters in length, 33% shorter than the Ark, and suffered such severe structural flexing that it required constant pumping to keep from sinking. Compare the Ark against contemporary reference points. The total internal volume was approximately 43,000 cubic meters. That is equivalent to the cargo capacity of around 520 standard railroad freight cars, or 372 full-size highway coaches parked side by side. The combined floor area of all three decks totaled approximately 9,300 square meters, larger than 1.5 professional football fields, and all of it was built by hand. The text says the ark was to be made of gopher wood, a term that appears only once in the entire Bible, in Genesis 6 verse 14, and whose precise botanical identification remains debated. Some researchers associate the term with cypress, others with teak. What is known is that the wood was to be sealed inside and out with pitch, kopher in Hebrew, a waterproofing resin. The process of cutting, drying, shaping and assembling that volume of timber, without electric saws, without cranes, without industrial fasteners, represented a physical undertaking of nearly inconceivable proportions. Calculate the magnitude of the manual labor. Engineering estimates suggest the ark required approximately 6,800 tons of timber, the equivalent of felling stripping, transporting, and fitting together something on the order of 3,500 large-growth trees. If Noah and his 3 sons, Shem, Ham, and Japheth, as named in Genesis 6 verse 10, worked alone, the project would have taken between 55 and 75 years to complete, assuming 10-hour workdays 6 days a week. Some rabbinic scholars, drawing on genealogical calculations, suggest the construction lasted exactly 120 years, the period mentioned in Genesis 6 verse 3 as the deadline God set before judgment. 2 Peter chapter 2 verse 5 describes Noah as a preacher of righteousness, meaning that throughout that entire period he was not only building, he was warning. Witness the moment and understand the solitude of this man. Decade after decade, Noah felled timber, shaped planks, applied pitch, and preached, and no one listened. The biblical text does not record a single convert outside Noah's immediate family, 8 people, out of a population that likely surpassed billions. The response rate was so close to 0, it defies any human logic of perseverance. And then, without warning, the deadline ran out. Genesis 7 verses 1 through 4. God commands Noah to enter the ark with his family. 7 pairs of every clean animal, 1 pair of every unclean animal, 7 pairs of every bird. The text is specific. 7 days before the flood began, the animals started arriving. The Hebrew verb used indicates they came of their own accord. Noah did not need to hunt them or capture them. They arrived by supernatural instinct, organized by kind, ready to board. Consider the logistical scope. Taxonomic studies estimate that the number of terrestrial air-breathing species needing representation on the ark was somewhere between 6,500 and 8,000, accounting for created kinds, not the modern species classification, which includes variations within the same genus. With pairs and groups of 7, the total number of animals on board would have fallen between 16,000 and 35,000 individuals. The daily food requirement for that number of animals, accounting for herbivores, carnivores, and omnivores of varying sizes, has been estimated at somewhere between 9 and 12 tons of feed per day. Over 370 days, the total period the ark remained afloat, according to the calculation drawn from Genesis 7 and 8. That amounts to somewhere between 3,300 and 4,400 tons of stored provisions. The total loaded weight of the ark, structure, animals, food, water, and 8 crew members has been estimated at between 20,000 and 25,000 tons, the equivalent of 7 modern frigate-class warships floating on timber. And then the event itself arrived. Genesis 7, verse 11. In the 600th year of Noah's life, in the 2nd month, on the 17th day of the month, on that same day, all the fountains of the great deep burst open, and the floodgates of the sky were opened. The text describes 2 simultaneous sources of water. The fountains of the great deep, Tehom Rabbah in Hebrew, indicate a massive eruption of subterranean waters. The floodgates of the sky indicate atmospheric precipitation on an unprecedented scale. No modern meteorological phenomenon compares. Dr. Walt Brown, a mechanical engineer from the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, developed the hydroplate theory, proposing that enormous pressurized water reservoirs existed beneath the pre-flood terrestrial crust at a depth of approximately 15 to 20 kilometers. When those chambers ruptured, the water would have been ejected at velocities exceeding Mach 2, over 2,400 kilometers per hour, creating a column of steam and debris reaching into the stratosphere. The combined effect of the subterranean eruption and the resulting atmospheric condensation would have produced rainfall of incalculable intensity on a global scale. Genesis 7 verse 12 records that the rain fell on the earth 40 days and 40 nights, but the total flooding event lasted far longer. The waters prevailed upon the earth for 150 days, as stated in Genesis 7, verse 24. And the complete process, from the start of the rain to the moment the ground had dried sufficiently for Noah to leave the ark, spanned 370 days, more than an entire year. Observe the scene from outside the ark. The water level rose until it covered all the mountains under all the heavens by 15 cubits, approximately 7 meters above the highest peaks. According to Genesis 7, verses 19 and 20, pre-flood geology likely presented a landscape significantly different from the present one: lower mountains, less pronounced valleys. Even so, the volume of water required to cover the entire habitable land surface represented a quantity of catastrophic proportions. Geophysical estimates suggest that even today there is sufficient water stored within the Earth's mantle to cover the planet's surface to a depth of at least 3 kilometers if all of it were released simultaneously. A study published in 2014 in the journal Science by researchers at Northwestern University identified a transition zone in the mantle between 400 and 700 kilometers in depth, containing ringwoodite, a mineral capable of storing water in a quantity equivalent to 3 times the combined volume of all current oceans. The water was there. It always had been. But the human cost of the flood is what transforms this narrative from geological account into existential tragedy. Genesis 7, verses 21 through 23. All flesh that moved on the earth perished, birds and cattle and beasts, and every swarming thing that swarms upon the earth, and all mankind. Of all that was on the dry land, all in whose nostrils was the breath of the Spirit of life, died. Thus he blotted out every living thing that was upon the face of the land, from man to animals to creeping things and to birds of the sky, and they were blotted out from the earth. And only Noah was left, together with those that were with him in the ark. Think about what that means on a human scale. Entire families, children, the elderly, communities that had built homes, cultivated fields, developed traditions, civilizations with language, art, technology. The text of Genesis 4, verses 20 through 22, records that before the flood there were already musicians, metalworkers who forged instruments of bronze and iron, herders and city builders. Tubal-Cain forged implements of metal. Jubal was the father of those who play the harp and flute. These were not primitive people, they were complex, creative, culturally developed human beings, and they all died. The process of death by drowning takes on average between 4 and 6 minutes. It begins with involuntary submersion. The body panics. The larynx goes into spasm to protect the airway. Carbon dioxide accumulates in the blood, generating intense chest pain. In approximately 90 seconds, the person loses consciousness. The brain, deprived of oxygen, begins to sustain irreversible damage after 4 minutes. Clinical death sets in between 5 and 10 minutes following submersion. Multiply that by billions. There was nowhere to run. There was no high ground high enough. There were no sufficient vessels. There was no time. The water rose, and the entire world became a single ocean with no shore. Mothers holding children above their heads as the water reached their shoulders. Men climbing trees that would be submerged within hours. Whole communities gathered at the highest points of their regions, watching the horizon disappear beneath a gray and endless surface. For months, inside the ark, the situation was different, but far from comfortable. 8 people caring for thousands of animals for over a year in a confined space. The daily maintenance demanded a brutal work regime. Feeding, cleaning, ventilation, disease management, waste disposal. A study published by the Center for Origins Research estimated that each of the 8 crew members needed to dedicate between 12 and 14 hours per day to basic animal husbandry alone. The internal temperature of the ark, generated by the metabolic heat of thousands of animals in an enclosed space, likely fluctuated between 32 and 38 degrees Celsius. a suffocating, humid environment with ammonia levels that would have required some form of efficient ventilation. The solution created a new problem. The ventilation described in Genesis 6, verse 16, an opening of 1 cubit, roughly 45 centimeters, along the upper portion of the ark, appears insufficient for a space of 43,000 cubic meters. Some scholars propose that the design incorporated a system of natural chimneys or distributed openings along the roof that exploited thermal pressure differentials to circulate air. Without such a system, toxic gas levels would have rendered the environment uninhabitable within weeks, and the psychological toll was as real as the physical one. Noah and his family spent 370 days without clear sunlight, without solid ground beneath their feet, without knowing with any certainty when it would end. The constant motion of a vessel the size of a football field and a half in open water, engineless, without any functional rudder mentioned in the text, subject to currents and winds of global scale. Motion sickness is nearly inevitable under such conditions. Deprivation of natural light directly affects the production of melatonin and serotonin, leading to sleep disorders, chronic fatigue, and depression. 370 days under those conditions constitutes a test of psychological endurance, surpassing any polar expedition or space mission ever recorded. But the most brutal work had not yet begun. Genesis 8, verse 1. God caused a wind to pass over the earth, and the waters began to subside. The fountains of the deep and the floodgates of the sky were closed. The rain was restrained, but the drainage took months. Genesis 8, verse 4, records that in the 7th month, on the 17th day of the month, the ark came to rest on the mountains of Ararat. The Ararat mountain range, located in present-day eastern Turkey, near the borders of Armenia and Iran, has its highest peak at 5,137 meters of altitude. The ark did not necessarily come to rest at the summit, but somewhere along the mountain range, possibly between 2,000 and 3,000 meters of altitude, where the slope would offer a viable landing surface for a structure of that scale. Noah waited. He released a raven. The raven did not return. He released a dove. The dove returned because it found no place to land. He waited 7 days. He released the dove again. It returned with an olive leaf in its beak. Genesis 8, verse 11. The olive tree is one of the most resilient trees in the Mediterranean basin, capable of re-sprouting from submerged roots. That leaf was biological proof that the earth was recovering. A single leaf. After a year. He waited another 7 days. He released the dove a 3rd time. It did not return. And finally, Genesis 8, verse 14. In the 2nd month, on the 27th day of the month, the earth was dry. 1 year and 10 days after the flood began. Noah was now 601 years old. Genesis 8, verses 20 and 21 records Noah's first act upon leaving the ark. He built an altar and offered burnt offerings. And God's response contains a phrase that resonates across the whole of biblical theology. I will never again curse the ground on account of man, for the imagination of man's heart is evil from his youth. The detail that stops the reading cold is this: the human condition had not changed. The heart remained inclined toward evil. God had not eliminated the problem by destroying the corrupted generation. He had preserved a lineage through which he would offer, centuries later, a different solution. The record shows something no one anticipated. The same God who sent the waters wept before sending them. The same God who destroyed the earth promised never to destroy it in the same way again. Genesis 9, verses 12 through 17, records God's first formal covenant with humanity, the covenant of the rainbow, a visible, atmospheric recurring sign that the waters would never again become a flood to destroy all flesh. The rainbow was not decoration, it was cosmic contract, but the effects of the flood permanently shaped both the planet and the species. Human longevity, which before the flood had reached 969 years in the case of Methuselah, as recorded in Genesis 5, verse 27, dropped precipitously in the generations that followed. Shem, son of Noah, lived 600 years. Arphaxad, Noah's grandson, lived 438 years. Shelah, his great-grandson, 333 years. Eber, 264. Peleg, 239. The decline curve is so steep and mathematically consistent that creationist researchers at the Institute for Creation Research have modeled it as a decreasing exponential function. The probable cause, according to those analyses, involves changes in atmospheric protection, possibly the collapse of a water vapor canopy that filtered ultraviolet radiation, combined with dietary changes and an accumulation of genetic mutations in a population reduced to a bottleneck of only 8 individuals, 8 people. Every human being alive today descends from those 8 people. Population genetics confirms that humanity passed through at least one extreme bottleneck in its distant past. Studies of mitochondrial DNA, inherited exclusively through the maternal line, indicate that all current human genetic diversity can be traced back to a surprisingly small number of ancestral female lineages. Geneticist Nathaniel Jensen, in research published in 2015, demonstrated that the human mitochondrial DNA mutation rate, when calibrated against modern empirical data rather than traditional evolutionary estimates, converges on a common origin of approximately 4,500 years ago, a time frame compatible with the biblical account. And then there is the geological evidence. The global fossil record shows billions of organisms buried and preserved in layers of water-deposited sedimentary rock spread across every continent. Marine fossils are found at the summit of Mount Everest, at 8,849 meters of altitude. Whale fossils have been discovered in Chile's Atacama Desert, more than 1,000 meters above sea level and more than a kilometer from the nearest coastline. Massive fossil graveyards, such as the one at Agate Springs, Nebraska, where approximately 9,000 animal bones from multiple species were found compacted into a single layer, suggest catastrophic and rapid burial events, not gradual deposition over millions of years. No uniformitarian geological model fully accounts for those deposits. Cultural traditions reinforce the biblical record in striking fashion. The anthropologist James George Fraser documented, in a work originally published in 1918, more than 260 flood narratives across cultures around the world. The Sumerians had Ziusudra. The Babylonians had Utnapishtim, recorded in the Epic of Gilgamesh, Tablet 11, dated to approximately 1900 years before the Common Era. The Hindus had Manu, the Greeks had Deucalion, the Chinese had Nuwa, the Aztecs had Nata, the Aboriginal Australians, isolated for tens of thousands of years according to conventional chronology, possess multiple narratives of global inundation in their oral traditions. The convergence of these accounts, all involving divine wrath, destruction by water, a survivor warned in advance, and a renewal of humanity, is statistically incompatible with independent invention. Something happened, something all of humanity remembered. Consider the geopolitical landscape immediately after the flood. Genesis 9, verse 1, repeats the same command given to Adam in Genesis 1, verse 28. Be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth. Humanity was given a second chance with the same instructions. But Genesis 9 also introduces something new, the authorization to eat meat per verse 3, and the institution of capital punishment for murder per verse 6. The post-flood world would operate under different rules. The violence that had corrupted the earth before would now be held in check by a system of consequences. And Noah, the man who had been perfect in his generations, the preacher who had warned for more than a century, the builder who had defied all logic to obey, that man, after saving humanity and the animals, planted a vineyard. And he got drunk. Genesis 9, verse 21, the hero of the flood, naked and unconscious in his tent. The biblical text does not conceal the failure. It does not edit out the weakness. It records that even the most righteous man of his generation was, in the end, profoundly human. And it was precisely that flawed man whom God chose to start over with. What appeared to be an absolute ending, the total destruction of an entire world, was in reality a civilizational surgery, painful, radical, with a cost in human lives that the biblical text neither minimizes nor celebrates. Genesis 6, verse 6, records that God repented. Before destroying, he suffered, and the fact that he preserved 8 people, 2 or 7 of each animal species, and a visible covenant in the heavens, demonstrates that the intention was never extermination. It was a new beginning. Centuries later, the prophet Isaiah, in chapter 54, verse 9, would call the flood the waters of Noah, and use it as the reference point for a greater promise, that God would never again reject his people. The Apostle Peter, in his first letter, chapter 3, verses 20 and 21, would connect the ark directly to baptism. The water that destroyed the ancient world would become a symbol of salvation in the new one. The instrument of judgment was transformed into an image of rescue, the same water. 2 meanings. The destruction carried within itself the seed of restoration. Noah did not see the Messiah. Shem, Ham, and Japheth did not know that their lineages would generate nations, empires, languages, and civilizations that would cover the face of the earth. The 3 wives whose names the text does not even record could not have imagined that every human being born across the next millennia would carry something of their genetic code. They descended from Ararat with mud beneath their feet, the smell of a washed world in their lungs, animals scattering across an unrecognizable landscape, and a single certainty. The bow in the sky meant that it would never happen that way again. Sometimes, the most powerful act in history is to build when no one believes, to enter when everyone stays outside, and to wait when there is no visible guarantee that the door will open on the other side.